Good morning. And the committee will come to order. Welcome and thank you all for joining us today's hearing entitled Care Where It Counts, Assessing the Department of Veterans Affairs Capital Asset Needs. Though this morning's hearing is ostensibly about VA's management of extensive capital asset portfolio, it's actually about something else altogether: patient care. VA is one of the federal government's largest property holding entities with a capital asset portfolio that includes thousands of medical facilities spanning hundreds of millions of square feet in both owned and leased space across the country. Managing and maintaining those properties and aligning them to meet the ever-changing shifts in patient population and in healthcare demand and delivery is increasingly complex and costly. And I might add that the private sector is doing the same thing. With bricks and mortar because of how medicine is practiced today. It's changing. The average VA medical facility building is 5 times older than the average building in a not-for-profit hospital system in this country, and was designed and built to meet the very different healthcare needs and delivery models than we see today. The consequences of this have been well documented in recent years by entities including the Independent Assessment, the Commission on Care, and the Government Accountability Office. All too often, current facilities, including those that have been well maintained, are not equipped to support the provisions of modern, high-quality care and are not well suited to providing care in the current VA healthcare system. VA does not consistently allocate capital to projects that address the greatest areas of veteran needs in the most cost-effective and timely manner. There's a wide and growing gap between VA's capital need and the antiquated and anticipated resources, and previous efforts to align and realign VA capital assets have failed. What's more, due to shifts in the veteran population, VA spends millions of dollars, taxpayer dollars, every year maintaining buildings that are empty or largely so. That led the Commission on Care to include this startling statement in their final report last year, and I quote, "VHA's principal mission is to provide health care to veterans, yet over time it has acquired an ancillary mission, caretaker of an extensive portfolio of vacant buildings," end quote. That is an extraordinary statement. VA's primary mission is caring for veterans, and it is those veteran patients, who bear the brunt of the consequences of VA's lack of physical infrastructure. We can no longer continue to allow VA's outdated, inflexible, and ill-suited capital asset program to compromise the department's core mission and the care provided to millions of our veterans. That's why I'm calling this morning a top-to-bottom review of all VA Health Administration capital assets. This is not something for VA or her champions to fear. As one of our witnesses, former VA Secretary Anthony Principi, will testify this morning, quotes, "VA will fail to honor our nation's commitment to its veterans if VA's medical system does not evolve with the times," end quotes. Rather than continuing to invest valuable resources on infrastructure, in many cases long past its prime, we need to take an objective view of all VA medical facilities and smartly plan for where and how we can divest of buildings and property that are no longer needed, and more importantly, for where and how we can grow to ensure that VA medical facilities maintain strong assets in communities across the country and are equipped to provide the care and services veterans need. As the veteran population continues to shift, care continues to evolve. VA's infrastructure continues to age, and veteran demand for care in the community continues to grow. A capital asset review and realignment, free of political influence, is critical to ensuring that the VA healthcare system remains strong and sustainable for veterans today and tomorrow. I'll now yield to Ranking Member Walsh for any opening statements that he may have.
Well, thank the chairman, and I want to thank our distinguished panel and Secretary Principi. It is great to have you back, and I think it's worth noting there's probably no one else in America knows the very issue we're going to talk about today more than you, and we are grateful you would find time to come and help us with this. I'd also like to thank the chairman. I know it goes against my Minnesota Lutheran roots to if you do a good deed and talk about it, it doesn't count, is the way we see these things, but I'm going to talk about it. I think it's become obvious in the short time of this new Congress that this committee is committed to tackling the big issues, to finding bipartisan solutions and getting them done. And I'm certainly glad that this is one the chairman decided to take on also. It's important. It's a complex and vast issue plaguing VA's ability to effectively manage its incredibly large capital assets portfolio are daunting. I do think it's worth noting the numbers, even for those of us up here. VA owns over 6,000 buildings encompassing over 151 million square feet. If we were as a committee to go visit each one of these buildings and spend an hour getting there and going between each one, and we did that 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year, we'd finish in 3 years getting through them. This is a massive undertaking, and it's one that we need to get our minds wrapped around. VA and Congress has been very aware of this issue since the late 1990s when the CARES Commission was established under the direction of Secretary Principi. However, GAO's recent report shows little progress has been made in improving the capital management. The effective management of VA's vast and aging capital asset portfolio is intimidating, yet it is incredibly important, and one I hope that we're willing to get done. Recently, GAO has found that VA has neither the process nor the data necessary to make a long-term decision regarding the alignment of its facilities to the needs of veterans. Today, GAO is going to testify that both the VAIP and the SCIP are ineffective and significantly flawed. The VAIP process is meant to determine veteran needs, simply put, while the SCIP process is meant to produce a long-term plan to align VA capital assets with that need. These processes are absolutely crucial to VA's ability to strategically determine gaps in VA capacity to meet veterans' need and then to produce a long-term plan to cover the gaps. But buildings don't deliver care or benefits. VA staff inside those buildings do. However, VA is unable to determine the amount of care its staff yields or has the potential to yield. Therefore, VA is unable to ensure existing structures are fully utilized by a highly productive staff and how that translates into veterans' care. In an age of billion-dollar medical facilities, this determination is absolutely imperative, and it's unacceptable we don't have it. Tomorrow, GAO is going to testify in front of the Health Subcommittee that VHA also lacks the ability to accurately determine the level of clinical productivity and efficiency of its health care providers. How can VA determine a building is necessary to meet a veteran's need when VA at this time can't determine how much need is being met using the existing building? Complex problems demand complex solutions. The failure of the CARES Commission to execute its recommendation proves that a commission is not enough. The cost of VA capital asset maintenance proves time is not on our side. I hope we, along with VA, are able to thoroughly consider pragmatic and timely solutions to the many costly issues impacting VA's ability to manage its care. And as the Secretary said, this is going to take courage. It's going to transcend politics. If it is not done now, we can no longer kick this can down the road, because if we do, the ability to deliver that care and the capacity to deliver that care will be diminished. And all of us here have a commitment to making sure that doesn't happen. So, Mr. Chairman, I once again thank you for tackling the tough problems, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Wallace. And joining us on our first and only panel this morning is the Honorable Anthony Principi, former Secretary of the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, and welcome, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Roscoe Butler, been here many times, the Deputy Director of Health Care for the Veterans Affairs and Rehabilitation Division of the American Legion. Thank you for being here. Deborah Draper, the Director of Health Care Team for the Government Accountability Office, again, many times here. And Jim Sullivan, the Executive Director of the Office of Asset Enterprise Management for the Department of Veterans Affairs, who is accompanied by Dr. Reagan Crump, the Assistant Deputy Undersecretary for Health Policy and Planning at the Veterans Administration, and welcome. Thank you all for being here, and Secretary Principi, we'll be beginning with you, and you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Waltz, members of the committee. It's certainly an honor to be back before you this morning, and I just commend you for the working relationship that all members have, and veterans should be reassured that you are tackling the tough issues. So thank you very, very much. Medical care is a key component of the benefits and services enacted by Congress in recognition of the sacrifices of the men and women whose service in uniform preserved and protected our nation's freedoms. Neither medical science nor the veteran population is static and unchanging, and VA must always provide veterans with modern, high-tech facilities to offer them high-quality health care. The Department will fail to honor our nation's commitment to its veterans if VA's medical system does not evolve with the times. VA is a proud organization with a great history. The Department has made enormous contributions to American health care across the spectrum of care, research, rehabilitation, and has been a lifeline for tens of millions of veterans returning to our shores. But many VA medical centers were designed and built in an era in which medical care was synonymous with hospital care and long-term psychiatric care. Facilities built in the 20s and 30s, 1,700 beds, still in existence today, with an average daily census of maybe 166 patients. American medicine and VA healthcare has transformed itself from hospital-centered to patient-centered treatment. Most veterans, like most Americans, see their physicians on an outpatient basis, and much treatment is provided by prescription drugs. However, while the practice of VA medicine has evolved, VA medical infrastructure has not kept pace. VA facilities are out of step with changes in the practice of medicine and with the statutory changes in VA's healthcare benefits package. In addition, millions of veterans, following the population migration patterns of the nation, have moved to different parts of the country. And as GAO noted in its recent report on VA real property, the New Choice program has also reduced the need for some VA facilities and services VA offers. If VA does not realign itself, the current decline in the veteran population will make many VA medical centers museums of the past, not the guideposts for the future they should be to care for our nation's veterans. When I became Secretary in 2001, President George Bush reminded me that every dollar my agency spends is a dollar taken out of someone else's hard-earned pay. It is not how much money you're given in your budget, he told me, that's important. He said it's whether you spend the money wisely. We're stewards of the public trust, he reminded me, and we must never forget that. I had the opportunity to recall his words a short time later when I was stuck in traffic in New York City. As my car idled in front of the VA's Manhattan Hospital, I looked up at the hospital's enormous bed tower. Among the hundreds of windows looking out on First Avenue, only a handful were lit. I didn't know what to make of it. I learned a short term later when I returned to Washington that the hospital was one of many built in the 1940s and 50s to handle the influx of ill and injured World War II and Korean War veterans. It once held 800 veterans, as did nearby hospitals in the Bronx and Brooklyn. I was told that the 3 hospitals that night were caring for only 283 veteran patients altogether. All the other beds were empty, and there were tens of thousands of empty beds throughout VA's system. Accordingly, I commissioned a comprehensive assessment of VA's capital infrastructure and the demand for VA health care. The process was called Capital Asset Realignment for Enhanced Services, CARES, and it was modeled on DoD's infrastructure review process. The CARES Commission offered sound recommendations for realignment and reallocation of the department's capital assets to meet demand of VA's services over the next 20 years. Unfortunately, the CARES and DoD processes differed in one way. Under CARES, there was no requirement for Congress to adopt or reject the Commission's final recommendations as a package. As a result, recommendations for some needed new hospitals and outpatient clinics were accepted. Most of those to change, realign, or maybe close the mission of other facilities were rejected. I know that the difficulties of agreeing to such a procedure for members of Congress cannot be overstated. Having served as chairman of the 2005 Defense Base Closure and Realignment Commission, BRAC, I know firsthand from visiting many of the military installations slated for closure or realignment how trying this process can be for you and your states. The words closure and realignment are easy to write on paper, but they have profound effects on communities and the people who bring those communities to life. But VA is simply spending too much money on bricks and mortar rather than doctors and nurses. VA's current budget request is $186.5 billion. In my last year as secretary in 2005, that figure was $69.4 billion, a 268% increase. We are doing a disservice to veterans VA is charged to serve and to the American people if those resources are not used wisely and well. Our nation simply cannot afford to maintain a vast infrastructure built for a different time in healthcare delivery that was to care for tens of millions of veterans as they returned from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, and even from earlier conflicts. One other area in which there is an opportunity for both enhancing and using taxpayers' dollars more wisely is for VA and DoD to more widely share facilities and services at local levels. There are many DoD hospitals that have very low inpatient census as well. This is one of the CARES Commission's recommendations, and more can be done in this area. A full review of VA's infrastructure, members of the committee, is the right thing to do. A review that is open, transparent, and apolitical. Those impacted by the decisions deserve no less. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Buller, you recognize for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Each year, underutilized or vacant. VA has a large inventory of buildings that are over a half-century old, resulting in significant costs for upgrades and needed replacements of many parts of the facility's aging infrastructures. As I mentioned in my written statement, GAO has been reporting on this issue dating back to 1991, or probably even earlier. GA published a report titled, VA is struggling to respond to asset realignment challenges. It has been 26 years since the 1991 GAO report was issued, and we are here again today to have an open and candid discussion on how to address VA's capital asset needs. Good morning, Chairman Rowe, Ranking Member Waltz, and members of the committee. On behalf of our National Commander, Charles E. Smith, and the over 3 million voting members of our largest wartime veteran service organization, we want to say thank you for conducting this hearing that addresses VA's capital asset needs. Today, the Veterans Health Administration is the largest integrated healthcare system in the United States, providing care at over 1,233 healthcare facilities, including 168 medical centers and 1,065 outpatient sites of care of varying complexities, serving more than 8.9 million veterans. In spite of the exceptional health care VA provides, its aging infrastructure, with a number of buildings being underutilized or vacant, creates problems for VA to maximize the use of its capital assets. According to information provided by VA in FY 2016, VA had 403 vacant buildings at an annual operating cost of $6,674,227 and 784 underutilized buildings at an annual operating cost of $20,266,271. VA defines an underutilized building as an individual building that is occupied and in use, but the functions housed there do not require the full amount of space in the building to operate. If there was an unlimited funding, the easy answer would be to dispose of all of VA's vacant buildings and build new modern facilities. But the reality is that funding is not unlimited, and there are no easy answers to these questions, which is why everyone is here today to have an open and candid discussion to address VA's aging capital asset portfolio. In 2016, the American Legion renewed Resolution 136, Strategic Capital Investment Planning Program, which urges Congress to provide increased appropriations annually to address Departments of Veterans Affairs construction deficiencies and gaps identified by VA's Strategic Capital Investment Planning Program. VA includes activation costs in their future skip cost projections and allocations so that VA's budget will not have to offset this lack of funding, and VA continues to be transparent about SKIP's progress by publicly posting information about projects and costs on an annual basis. Based on the American Legion's review, addressing VA's capital asset need is not a new phenomenon. There have been numerous government reports over the last 26 years addressing the same topics. However, countries around the world have placed high value in their historic properties, such as historic capitals, and the U.S. and the United States visitors frequently visit Washington's monuments and the Lincoln Memorial. for its historic contributions to this nation's historic value. In the past, our System Worth Saving team has visited the Hot Springs, South Dakota medical facility, which was designated as a historic national property. Subsequently, VA was pursuing to close that facility until Dr. Shulkin overturned the former administration's decision. The American Legion calls on Congress and VA to place high value on VA's historic national properties. The American Legion is concerned that VA has not routinely actively engaged veteran service organizations in the discussion about their plans to address VA's capital asset needs. VA must do better involving VSOs in these discussions. 26 years later, we are still trying to find solutions to VA's capital assets needs. The American Legion hopes it doesn't take another 26 years to find solutions to VA capital assets needs. The American Legion thanks this committee for this opportunity to explain the position of the over 3 million voting members of the American Legion. Thank you.
Mr. Buller, thank you. In full disclosure, I just mailed my 2018 dues in before I came back.
Thank you, sir.
Ms. Draper, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Rowe, Ranking Member Waltz, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss VA's capital asset program, including our recently issued report that examined VA's efforts to align its medical facilities with veterans' needs. VA is one of the largest property holding agencies in the federal government. In 2014, VA reported that its inventory included more than 6,000 owned and 1,500 leased buildings, together covering approximately 170 million square feet of space. Many of these facilities are underutilized and outdated, creating a variety of challenges for alignment. As we discussed in our recent report, there are a number of factors that affect the department's alignment efforts. First, VA projects a 14% decrease in the veteran population by 2024. And as the map on the screen shows, up on the board, it also expects a continued migration of veterans from the Northeast and Midwest areas of the country to areas in the South and West, a trend that also mirrors that of the general population. Second, similar to trends in the healthcare industry overall, VA's model of care continues to shift away from inpatient to outpatient settings of care, the latter of which VA generally houses in converted inpatient space or in a growing number of outpatient clinics. The photo is of a closed inpatient wing at the Brooklyn facility. Third, although VA has traditionally provided care primarily through its own facilities, it is increasingly reliant on care provided in the community. Fourth, an aging infrastructure affects facility alignment because many VA facilities are not well suited to providing care in the current environment, as the photo of an outdated double occupancy room at the Manhattan facility shows. The average age of a VA medical facility is 60 years, which is 5 times older than that of an average not-for-profit hospital building. Facility planning officials told us that it is often too difficult and costly to modernize, renovate, and retrofit older facilities. Photos from the Waco facility illustrate these challenges. And finally, the historic status of some VA properties adds to the complexity of alignment. VA has approximately 3,000 historic buildings, structures, and land parcels, the third most in the federal government. In some instances, renovations may be more expensive, but demolition and rebuilding may not be an option given the historic designation. These photos of buildings and structures designated as historic from the Kerrville, Chillicothe, and Waco facilities provide good examples. VA has recognized the need to improve planning and budgeting for modernizing its aging infrastructure and aligning its facilities with veterans' needs. A previous effort at doing this, known as CARES, was never fully implemented and was halted about 8 years ago. VA has more current efforts to align its facilities with veterans' needs, including the SCIP process and the integrated planning process. However, both of these have limitations. VA relies on the SCIP process to plan and prioritize its capital projects, but limitations such as subjective narratives, long time frames, and restrictive access to information underline VA's ability to achieve its goals. For example, the time between when facility planning officials begin developing their SCIP narratives and when they are notified that a project is funded has taken between 17 and 23 months over the past 6 fiscal years' SCIP submissions. While some of the budget timing is outside of VA's control, Delays in reporting of the SCIP results has made it difficult for local officials to understand the likelihood that their projects would be funded. The integrated planning process also has limitations. Among other goals, it is intended to produce facility master plans for every VA medical center at a total cost of more than $100 million when complete. A significant limitation to this process is that it assumes that all future growth and services will be provided directly through VA facilities, an inaccurate assumption given the increasing role of care in the community. Some local VA officials told us that they bypassed the integrated planning process and instead contract for their own facility master plans. Additionally, VA has faced stakeholder challenges to its facility alignment actions, including from veterans, state, local, and federal officials, employees, historic preservation groups, and others. We found that VA has not consistently followed best practices for effectively engaging stakeholders in these decisions or evaluated the effectiveness of their stakeholder communication strategies. In conclusion, we made several recommendations that, if implemented, could improve VA's ability to plan for and facilitate its alignment efforts. Specifically, we recommended that VA improve the SCIP process, discontinue or improve the utility of the integrated planning process, and improve communications with stakeholders. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my opening remarks. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Draper. Thanks very much. And Mr. Sullivan, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Rowe, Ranking Member Waltz, and members of the committee. I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Regan Crump, and we're here today to discuss VA's capital asset needs, and we acknowledge the many challenges that face us as we attempt to modernize the VA healthcare system. VA's mission is distinct compared to other agencies. We operate the largest integrated healthcare system in the nation with 135 national cemeteries, 1,700 hospitals, clinics, and facilities used to provide benefits and services to our veterans. Our portfolio consists of approximately 180 million square feet, 86% of which is owned, and in many cases, the average age of a facility exceeds 60 years. Most of our infrastructure is in need of repair and replacement and requires considerable investment. VA has more than $50 billion in capital needs to upgrade existing facilities or replace existing facilities to meet modern healthcare standards. Secretary Shulkin has made it one of his top 5 priorities to modernize the VA system. We are supporting his priority by getting rid of buildings that are no longer needed to provide services to veterans. We've identified 430 individual vacant buildings totaling 6 million square feet across the country. It costs VA an average of $7 million a year to operate these buildings, and we want to redirect these resources to services. We are initiating disposal or reuse actions for these 430 vacant buildings over the next 2 years. VA will begin performing due diligence, ensuring compliance with applicable laws and regulations, and initiate disposal or reuse transactions. In the last 30 days alone, we commenced the process for 71 vacant buildings through an enhanced use lease for repurposing buildings at Perry Point, Maryland, 54 buildings, and we completed the accessing process to GSA of the hospital in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which was 17 buildings. While we are working with an aggressive timeline to address our vacant buildings, we anticipate hurdles that may slow us down. Some challenges that can impact our timeline include the lengthy processes associated with the National Historic Preservation Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and the location and condition of buildings and local and national stakeholder concerns. VA welcomes any support from Congress to streamline these processes so that we can more efficiently and effectively manage our assets. While challenges do exist, and there are many, we have made some progress reducing unneeded buildings. Since 2004, we have disposed or reused over 1,000 buildings, totaling approximately 8 million square feet and about 1,000 acres. One of the most successful tools we've experienced using is our Enhanced Use Lease Authority. EUL allows VA to outlease assets to private and public sector entities for repurposing. Currently, we can outlease vacant buildings and excess land in return for supportive housing for homeless veterans and their families. This program has provided significant benefits to VA in terms of cost savings, improved facilities, and increased services to our veterans. To date, over 4 million square feet has been outleased through EUL, and we have in place 2,700 operational housing units across the country. VA previously had a broader EUL authority, but that expired in 2011. And our 2008 budget includes legislation requesting the reintroducing of a broader scoped EUL. VA needs your help and welcomes any new or expanded tools to address our most challenging assets issues that we have. Our 2018 budget includes proposed legislation to increase VA's flexibility to meet some of these needs. The budget includes proposals: 1, to increase the threshold for the minor construction program to $20 million, eliminate statutory impediments to acquiring joint VA facilities, much as Secretary Principi mentioned in his testimony, expanded EUL authority, and providing for the authorization of 28 major medical leases to serve the outpatient needs of our veterans. In terms of addressing recommendations of the independent assessment, the Commission on Care, and GAO, VA agrees with the majority of these recommendations and recognizes we need to do better. We are working towards that goal of a high-performing healthcare networks that take into account current and future veteran demand. VA partnered with private sector experts to conduct objective assessments and develop local healthcare modernization optimization plans. The primary outcomes of this assessment will be plans for each market across the country to develop a high-performing healthcare network, which will then feed into VA's capital planning process and SCIP. Once the market assessments are complete, recommendations may include needed capital investments, divestitures, partnerships, and other approaches to modernize VA's infrastructure. These investments then will be prioritized and included in future budget requests. VA expects the market area optimization plans will address many of the issues raised by GAO, the Commission, in the independent assessment. Mr. Chairman, ranking members, and members of this committee, this concludes my statement. We welcome any suggestion, and as we confront this major challenge facing the VA, I'm happy to respond to any of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan, and thank all the members of the group that's here today. And I want to start by just saying a couple things. One, this is very hard, and this is not glitzy stuff, but this has got to be done. And I appreciate what each one of you bring to the table. And as I said in my opening remarks, that the private sector is undergoing exactly the same thing. The hospital that my two children were born in Memphis was at the time the largest private hospital in the world, 2,000 beds, Baptist Memorial Hospital. That hospital's gone. It's been dropped, and they've now downsized to a more efficient, 21st century model where care can be given. And there were just hundreds and hundreds of empty beds in that hospital. And they realized years ago they had to change their model. And I think the VA is undergoing exactly the same thing as the private sector is doing now. And Mr. Butler, you brought up some great points about the historic buildings, and I think we need to look at public-private partnerships, what we can do with these. We have one in my local VA at home that's a medical, basically a museum that could be used. If you engage the private sector and let them maintain the building, there are a lot of options out there that we could do to maintain these historic buildings and have them used for other purposes, and certainly not just bulldoze them. I think there are many communities that would love to do that and share that rich culture in their community. I think Walter Reed was an example. We realized that fixing Walter Reed just wasn't, I mean, as much as I love going over there, it was just too much of an investment for modern healthcare, so that we moved it out to Bethesda and to a more modern facility. So I think the DOD has done some of that, and I think VA is going to do that. And let me just ask any of you who can answer this, how can you elaborate on how patient care is impacted by aging infrastructure? And would it be fair to say that access to care is, in some cases, negatively impacted by the limitations of an aging VA medical facility? And any one of you can take that question.
Well, I'll start, Mr. Chairman. I certainly think that's the case. If you're devoting scarce resources to bricks and mortar, you're taking care away from veterans. And I think first and foremost, we have to provide high quality care to veterans, whether it be in an inpatient facility, high-tech inpatient facility, outpatient clinic, or the community. Public-private partnership, as this committee has advocated. So I think there is an impact on quality of care, and unless changes are made, I think it will continue to do so.
Mr. Butler. Yes, sir.
Hot Springs, South Dakota is a prime example of where That facility is a National Historic designated facility, and it was a facility that was designated to be closed. The community was in uproar because of that decision. It would place veterans having to drive much further to other facilities to obtain their care because care in the local community was not available for them. And so I think you have to look at everything in totality to make sure that when you make those decisions, you're taking everything that needs to be considered in play to make sure that the veterans' care, they can receive the best care, regardless if it's in a VA facility or it's outside the VA facility. But you have to ensure that if you're closing, if the recommendation is to close a facility, that the veteran can obtain that quality care elsewhere that is convenient for the veteran and does not cause hardship to the veteran.
I could not agree more. I think if you are doing that, you should be able to show that actually the quality of the care will go up, that not lose quality. I could not agree more with that. Mr. Sullivan, how much total resources are spent maintaining space that's either vacant or largely vacant across the entire, you may not know this, across the entire VA system?
The cost that we're spending on the 430 vacant buildings today is around $7 million annually. If we included what was in the underutilized list as well, it comes to about $29 million.
And so that's a building that's there that's not, or very underutilized, or
it's a building. If you look at the example, if you had a clinic that had 100,000 square feet and your real requirement based upon veteran need is 10,000 square feet, but you're using it 100,000 to serve your 10, that's what an underutilized facility is.
They didn't start the clock on me till sometime, so I think I've run out of time, but I'm not sure. So I'm going to yield to Mr. Waltz.
He's kind, I agree. So, well, thank you all, and a great testimony, and I think teeing up where we're at. So I'm gonna cut right to the chase, Mr. Secretary, with you. Is, in your opinion, I think we all probably know the answer, but it's important, I think, to hear it in this setting. What was the biggest barrier towards the implementation of the full CARES Commission, and how would you suggest we don't make that same mistake?
Well, I think the clearest limitation, and I might add, I was very proud of the CARES process. I think the team did an extraordinary job. It was data-driven. It was based on sound information, and very importantly, I insisted that there be listening sessions, that they travel around the country and talk to the communities, talk to labor, talk to management, and really get their insights, because it's a difficult process. But the clearest, and the veterans organizations were fully behind the CARES process, and they stood with me when the decisions were made. But obviously, unlike the DOD process, when you don't have some teeth behind it, it will fail. The pluses were good, but those that wanted to realign or close a facility became difficult because of the political process, which I enormously respect. It becomes very, very difficult, and I tried to point that out in my testimony. So I think that this committee, I urge this committee to create a commission. Allow the Secretary, who I think is doing a great job, allow him to come up with the recommendations, submit them to a bipartisan commission, and give the commission some teeth based on their decisions. Submit the plan to Congress, and let the Congress vote on the plan up or down, rather than singling out individual facilities.
No, I appreciate that. And Mr. Butler, I'm up here. I was just showing the photo around. I'm very familiar with the hot springs. I lived in Chadron, Nebraska, and then in Pine Ridge for a while. I think people need to know that facilities drawing from South Dakota, Nebraska, and Wyoming, and it's pretty open out there. And that is probably one of the most beautiful VA buildings. That administration building is gorgeous. So I think trying to balance these things of how do we save some of these assets in terms of their historic value. But that one always comes up with me because of the massive number of beds, and I think that one might be utilized 3 beds a night because of this change. So I'm very cognizant of that. I want to come back to the process, and maybe this is for Ms. Draper and then to you, Mr. Sullivan, about what we're trying to get to. And Ms. Draper, first of all, based on what you know, are either the VAIP or the SCIP processes truly reflective of veteran need, VA resources, and stakeholder concerns when managing capital assets? Is this the best practice way to do this?
Well, we have found limitations with both, as I talked about. One of the issues with the SCIP the SCIP process, it is supposed to be a 10-year planning process, but the emphasis is really on the first year. So what local facilities told us is they often, to address gaps identified through the SCIP process, they often put projects in out years that they never intend to actually undertake. So really the focus is on the first year. It is not a long-term planning process, as we found and we talked about in our report. There are also many limitations with the integrated planning process. One is that it doesn't account for, in addition to the not accounting for the care in the community, which is a major assumption that should be considered, because you don't want to simultaneously develop new capacity while you're also getting it delivered in the community. But it also has other limitations. For example, the costs don't include all the life cycle costs of a project. So there are operating costs that are not included that you know, which OMB recommends they be included. There's a lack of standardization in the facility master plan, so they have different contractors doing the master plans, and so there's a lot of variation. So it's really difficult to determine how comparable they are. And then the other thing, and I think we've talked about this a little bit, is accountability. So there are recommendations that come out of the integrated planning process, but there are no requirements for those to be implemented.
That's a question, and I think I'm going to leave it to my colleagues. They'll have questions to ask, because obviously in this, and I'm sure Mr. Kaufman will bring up, in this planning process was certainly the Denver VA facility. And this year, I'm wondering, how does all this fit together when we see the VA's budget requests a cut to construction by 4.3%? Was that budget crafted by looking at these things, putting it together, deciding how we're going to dispose of these buildings, how we're going to repurpose, and what we need to do to build? I just wonder, and I know it's out there, and I don't want to be that person who drives by a construction project and think I know better than how it's done or why it was decided to do that. But I, as a member of this committee, am having a hard time understanding how we're making those decisions. So I want to just leave that layout there, that I think we need to know, how did we come up with our budgeting numbers? How do we know what we really need? Because I am still not convinced we know how to utilize that. And I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Dr. Wenstrup, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. And I think it's important to note that this committee is dedicated to the care of our veterans, as well as respecting the history of the VA and this nation. So as we move forward, we are going to be facing challenges. One of the things I've harped on since I've been here is really knowing how productive we are when it comes to patient care. And I've always talked about relative value units, RVUs, and using that as one standard of measure. So Mr. Sullivan or Dr. Crump, maybe you can answer for everyone how exactly doctors that are providing for our veterans in the CHOICE program, how are they paid?
Today, in the CHOICE program, doctors are paid based on a fee basis. And so we're using the Medicare rates for the—
Which is RVUs, correct? Relative value units.
Well, some of the basis of the fees is RVUs, but it's a fee basis.
Okay, so we are tracking that. We know how we're paying them and what they're producing. So do we track RVUs for all of our producers across the entire VA? Do we know what they are producing? And I'm going back to something I think GAO did a couple years ago that ended up evaluating what it cost in certain facilities for a primary care visit. And it came down to, when you add up all the expenses of the facility, et cetera, that it was really around $400 to $600 per office visit in certain locations. So I think it's important that we are tracking productivity as we do this review. So are we able at this time to track RVUs of every provider in the VA?
What we're doing right now is changing some of our methodologies for tracking productivity, and we are incorporating the use of RVUs on a national basis.
But so far that hasn't been done as like a requirement.
It has been done to some extent.
Because I think, to some extent, I think that's really something we have to look at when we're looking at our assets, is how much is actually being produced in a certain facility. Maybe it's a physical limitation, or maybe we're just spending way too much. It's, I think, an important tool as we're taking on this challenge to understand what's going on. Because, for example, if I was paid $100 per RVU, to pay all of my bills in a private practice, I couldn't sustain that very long. And so I think that we have to look at that and say, you know, look at our productivity per cost. And the other question I have is, are there incentives right now in the VA management to reduce costs or increase productivity? In other words, reduce costs without reducing productivity, or to increase productivity in some way that we're getting more bang for our buck? Are there incentives for that in our management?
Dr. Winstrup, there are provider incentives for productivity, and we're also in the process of one of the largest modernizations of VA healthcare in history. And so improving employee performance and productivity is a part of that process.
Can you take a second to describe what that incentive is for a provider?
I don't think I would be able to describe the exact specifications of that methodology today, but we can get back to you.
And does it vary, or is it across the board, do you know?
It's across the board.
Okay. Well, thank you, because I think this is going to be an important thing going forward. And if it takes us mandating that this be one of the tools that we have as we evaluate our assets, then I think that we should do that right here and put that into legislation where we understand what we're actually producing. And then hopefully at a local level, you'll have people be able to make some decisions that make sense. Where you're actually looking at what you're getting. What is your bang for the dollar, bang for the buck that we're getting? So with that, I want to yield back, but I thank you for that input. And I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Ms. Draper.
I don't. I know that they're working on, you talked about productivity, but they don't measure RVUs for every specialty that way. So I think they're in the process of looking at that, as Dr. Crump talked about.
Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Takano, you recognize for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sullivan, of the 430 buildings that VA is designated as vacant, how many provide some type of direct care to veterans?
None.
None. Okay. How many? How does the VA plan to ensure the veterans' ability? So really, since none of them provide direct care, we don't really have a concern about how the VHA is going to provide. The veterans who have, so we don't have veterans that are receiving direct care.
No, a few of them have some support, administrative support in them that will be relocated, but there's no direct care in any of those buildings.
Okay. And how was the VA able to determine the percentage of utilization for the 430 vacant buildings?
It was based upon the folks on the ground in the field identifying those buildings as vacant or having minimal use.
Okay, and of these buildings that we mentioned, that we intend to either dispose or reuse, how many have been determined to be unsuitable for the provision of services to homeless veterans?
In conducting the due diligence, that's one of the items that will be looked at.
Okay, so it's not really been determined yet.
There's been an initial review that annually to see if any of those buildings are candidates for homeless housing. And some of them, for example, in Perry Point, as I mentioned earlier, 47 of those buildings are in the 400, came off because we could reach a private sector developer to handle the housing of those buildings. So there are some, but a lot of them are in such condition that it really becomes
So the evaluation is not really complete for all of the 400.
Correct.
Okay. Are there current barriers regarding the usage of an EUL to ensure the property is determined to be suitable for the purpose of providing services to homeless veterans? This question is kind of worded. So are there barriers regarding the usage of an EUL to ensure that the property is determined to be suitable for the purpose of providing services to homeless veterans are utilized quickly and efficiently?
The only barriers are actually the financing. So from a legislative standpoint, the fix that was made to this program a couple of years eliminated most of the barriers in terms of housing. What the barrier would be is if you wanted to go to a medical EUL model, which is I think what people talked about earlier, which really probably is the future at VA if we can bring in private sector expertise and private financing to provide state-of-the-art facilities. That would require a change to that program or additional authority to that program or a complementary program so that we could use that to go out and get needed medical facilities. Right now we're restricted to just homeless housing or support housing.
So the current statutory framework kind of constrains us to serving the homeless, but if we were to expand into partnerships
correct.
in the health area, this would greatly expand our ability to.
That will be one of the tools to fill the gap, especially as I believe GAO and others have testified here. We know there's not a limitless pot of money to deal with VA facilities, so we have to look at another source. And I think tapping private sector financing is the long-term solution to our capital needs. And not only the capital piece of it in terms of their financeability that they would bring to it, but also using some of their expertise, using local codes and standards, using local practices in the community. So when we came in and put a clinic in or a support facility, we use those standards and those practices there so that they would be financeable, and they would also, should VA not have a use for them in the future or as time went on, they would easily be reusable by the private sector because we were using kind of their script for doing this. And I think that is absolutely key as we go forward. And I know we're working within the administration, hopefully in the President's infrastructure bill, to submit that kind of a proposal to Congress.
Well, Mr. Sullivan, can you, with this in mind, what is the status of the private partner, partnership pilot program?
Right now, we do not have a true public-private partnership program. What we have is the CHIP-In Act, which is a donation program that Congress gave us, which we really appreciate, for 5 pilot sites. What we would see as a better model, or not a better model, but an additional model, would be an expanded EUL or a true P3 program that would allow us to tap private sector financing and private sector expertise. And I think in this instance, there's not just one single tool that's going to give us this. I think we need to look at it with multiple tools, whether it's EUL, P3, other models, which other folks on the committee may have ideas on as well. I mean, we need to look at a whole suite of tools to be able to deal with this huge challenge we have.
Speaking to members who have districts with some of these aging facilities, I mean, I think you're right. I think there's a lot of folks that are looking at all sorts of ways they can reuse these properties, which I believe would not have to be to the detriment of providing the current health care needs of the veterans that are being served. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Mr. Kaufman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Principi, for being here today and for your service to our country as a former Secretary of the VA. 430 buildings, VA buildings, vacant for the most part. Now, it is my understanding that the Secretary, when you were Secretary and the Secretary now, doesn't have the unilateral authority to close any of these facilities, or dispose of any of these facilities. Am I correct in that?
I believe he does have the authority.
He does have the authority.
Yeah, absolutely, and then again, it could be stopped or rescinded by Congress if they elect to do so. But I believe I had the authority to close or realign VA facilities or buildings, subject to certain limitations.
Okay, Mr. Sullivan.
We're talking about here are individual buildings, and there is no prohibition on the closing of individual buildings except complying with historic, environmental, and other regulatory issues that do take some time, but there is no prohibition on those.
But I understand closing, but disposing of.
There's no prohibition. We will either reuse it through one of our tools, or we will do a report of excess and give it to GSA, as we have, for example, just on the Pittsburgh Hospital.
So why haven't you moved on the 430 buildings that now stand vacant?
We have, and in this case, we have moved on in the last 30 days. We've moved on about, I can give you the exact numbers, about 35 of them. We expect to move on 71 of them within 6 months, and within another year, about 71 additional ones. So by the end of 2 years, we will do the entire 420 will be commenced in that process, whatever it is.
And how long does that process take to go through, or is it?
It's really market-driven, based upon if we're going to GSA to sell it, it's going to be based upon the market, what GSA can get for those buildings and how hard they find to do it. If we find a partner to reuse it, it could move pretty quickly. If it's a simple demolition, depending upon historic and environmental issues at the site, it can be anywhere from 6 months to 18 months, depending upon that process. It is very locally driven, and in each state, for example, the historic preservation entity is, in some states, are very cooperative with VA and look to move forward. In other states, it's more of a challenge, and that takes more time.
Does once you turn it over to GSA, do they take it from there, or is it, do you have to, is it a cooperative?
It's cooperative, but they really have the ball. They're the
Okay.
ones who do this all the time.
Good.
They have an office set up that just does this as their single focus. And that's why we took Pittsburgh, for example, and give it to them. We plan to have 2 or 3 other hospitals that have been vacant for a long time, moving to GSA pretty quickly.
Why is it taking so long to get this process started? It just seems like you've identified the 430, but then it seems like we're just starting on this process.
Well, now, since 2004, I think I can give you the figures.
Right.
I think we have gotten rid of 8 million square feet through this process. We did not use GSA, quite honestly, until the last year or two, because prior experiences with GSA were not very receptive to moving properties, but I think they have retooled and refocused, so I think it is a good opportunity.
Okay. What is the point of having a hotel in Paris?
VA, I think you're referring to the Pershing Hall.
Yes.
So yes, Congress gave it to VA because at the time it had fallen dormant. There were squatters in the building. They gave it to VA after several other agencies attempted to maintain it, and we used an EU-like authority to put a hotel in place, and VA receives $300,000 to $400,000 a year in rent from that hotel. And I know there's a proposal for folks who want to sell it. VA supports selling that. We don't have the authority to do it. And if we are given the authority, we would hope that the basis for the sale would be the market value of that asset, which we believe is somewhere between $30 and $35 million, which we would hopefully in that legislation be given the authority to reinvest that money in care for veterans or in infrastructure improvements. So we were tasked by Congress to take it over, and we did it, and there's no pride in ownership of that asset. I mean,
Thank you. Mr. Principi, was that under your watch, or was that?
Actually, Mr. Sullivan knows it was on my watch when I was Deputy Secretary during Bush 41, and Chairman Montgomery of this committee urged me to take possession. It was actually an American Legion. It's called Pershing Hall. It's an American Legion building, an absolutely extraordinary structure in the heart of Paris, and it was in really, as Mr. Sullivan indicated, really in a state of disrepair, and magnificent artifacts were being stolen, and so I became the landlord, so to speak, and became a hotel, and that's where it stands today.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, gentleman, for yielding. Ms. Brownlee, you recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too thank the panelists for being here this morning. I wanted to direct my line of questioning around leasing and what I believe to be advantages of leasing versus building brick and mortar facilities across the country, and particularly when you look at our community clinics across the country. And I know right now, today, we have 30 lease authorizations for facilities, for clinics across the country, but yet we don't seem to get there. I think there's a rationale behind that, but I was just wondering, Mr. Sullivan, you know, with 30 lease authorizations out there for new facilities but not meeting that need, I mean, what do you think that delay is with regarding patient care?
right now we have 28 leases that are 28 that are pending authorization, and that represents about 2.2 million annual visits of care. Many of these have been submitted in the budget for the last 2 years. We believe we have not had a case where a lease has closed, but we're very fearful that about 50% of these are replacement leases for existing leases that are out there, and through a lot of good work and diligence by our real property people, we've kept them all open. But at some point, an owner of one of these leases could say, I don't want to stay anymore. So I mean, there is some risk there. Also, probably a bigger risk is that once we reach the end of some of these terms, we're at the mercy of the person who owns it. And in a lot of cases, they have increased the rents, and we have no choice but to pay it. So I mean, it is a big issue for us in terms of creating that additional access. And we believe leasing is better, not in every case, but in a lot of cases, than building and owning, so that we can walk away at the end of a lease term if we have to.
Well, thank you, and I agree. I think leasing, based on the map that the GAO showed in terms of changing demographics across the country, I think leasing gives us the appropriate flexibility that we need to be able to change and move given the movement and where the greatest needs are. And I know that currently the GSA scores leasing for veteran facilities differently than they do for any other federal government buildings. And can you comment on, I know I have a piece of legislation to try to fix that, but that seems to be one of the big barriers in terms of authorizing these leases, is that if it's a 20-year lease or a 30-year lease, it's scored for the full cost of 20 years or 30 years in the first year, and that's the barrier. So can you comment on that, and do you recognize that there needs to be a fix?
Absolutely recognize there needs to be a fix. Secretary Shulkin challenged us a couple of months ago to meet with CBO, who is the scorer, as many people know, of these transactions, and we met with CBO, and they told us in no uncertain terms that the way our leases are structured, and even if we change the way they are structured, there's nothing we can really do to the transaction that would have them change their score. So that is the legislative holdup, and I think the score on the legislation is probably around $1 billion, I think, is what they came up with.
I apologize, I said GSA, I meant CBO.
CBO, sorry.
But to Ms. Draper, do you have any comments on, how these leases are scored and where you think improvements might be or not?
I haven't really looked at that, so I would be unable to comment on that, but I could see if we have done work on that and provide you some additional information.
Okay. I think, I again, just personally believe that this is something that we've got to fix, that the way it's scored, I don't know if anybody on the panel, Mr. Presepi, maybe you know the history behind this and why it was changed. I'm not even sure exactly when it changed, but I have been told that it was changed a while ago, specifically just for VA facilities and no changes for any other federal buildings.
Yeah. I don't recall exactly when it was changed. It was done by OMB in the 2000 timeframe, I believe. Maybe Mr. Sullivan knows. I don't recall.
Nobody knows the rationale for it, though.
CBO about 4 years ago, 5 years ago, just changed the way which they treated these as operating leases and started scoring them over the entire term of the lease. I can't come to explain how they changed their interpretation. I'd leave that to them to explain.
Well, I think it's an important piece of this kind of overall discussion is trying to really focus on this, and as we move forward and evaluating facilities and evaluating, I think, the advantages of leasing over building permanent structure so that we do have this nimbleness and flexibility. With that, I'll yield back.
Gentlelady, if you're yielding, I will just make a quick comment that the way this is scored, we have to give the CBO the Forrest Gump Award. Stupid is as stupid does. Nobody in the world would score. Anyway, I'll yield now to Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sullivan, you've addressed the enhanced use lease program greatly. To my colleagues, I'd like to add that my office requested data for last couple of months regarding identifying actual structures that were perhaps targeted for sale or destruction. And ultimately, last night, we found that there was one in my state and none in my district. So my comment may apply more to my colleagues than to myself, but during the course of researching what we would do with those facilities if they existed in my district, we're concerned about veteran homelessness and transitional housing for our veteran brothers and sisters that struggle with reentry into the civilized endeavors when they leave the military. And many of these facilities have you know, many rooms that could be considered a small apartment. They have kitchen facilities and laundry facilities and meeting facilities, and they could be remodeled into transitional housing for homeless veterans. So in the process of researching this, I spoke with veteran-owned construction companies in my district, and every one of them was adamant that they would be willing to donate their services and their own private capital to remodel and restore these facilities. We also spoke with charitable services that work with homeless and indigent Americans, and they'd be willing to lease the properties and maintain them once they were remodeled over a 20 or 30-year lease. So I would suggest that common sense solutions like this be considered regarding the structures that exist that are targeted for sale or destruction. Perhaps the relationship between the VA and the VHA and the public and private sector can include solutions that would cost the people's treasure virtually nothing and yet would provide an invaluable service for transitional housing for homeless veterans across the country. Doesn't affect my district because I don't have any structures, but perhaps some of my colleagues may consider this approach. Ms. Draper, my question is for you regarding the means by which money is assessed. Personally, I believe the money should follow the veteran, and I believe that we should move away from the mothership structure of historically the VA and VHA has maintained. My district represents the highest density of veterans in the state, but we don't receive the highest percentage of money, and this money is assessed according to the veteran population that's registered within the VA. But the veterans, because of the need to travel to the mothership hospital, and in my case, Alexandria, the veterans have lost faith in the system, so they're not counted. They're not counted. The veteran himself is not counted. They're only counted, and the money is aligned according to those that are registered within the system. But we're seen to be blind to the fact that so many thousands and thousands of our veteran brothers and sisters have become disenfranchised with the system. That's the problems that we're trying to fix here. So can you please speak to whether, when assessing where assets are most needed, the VA consider the entire eligible veteran population or solely the enrolled veteran population as we work to expand more care to veterans? I think it's important that this money be assessed based on reality.
Well, they use a couple of models. One is the veteran population model, VetPop, and then looking at another model of demand for care and the resources that would be needed to supply those demands. One of the things that we talked about in terms of the SCIP process, the long-term planning process, is that they're trying to match or align the needed facilities for services for the veteran population. And one of the key weaknesses that we found is that sometimes writing the SCIP narratives, which is a third of the scoring process, or the score, it really is often dependent on the ability of the writer to meet some of the goals of what VA has laid out rather than the merits of the project itself. So we found cases in the field where some facilities never had a SCIP project funded. So, there needs to be, that's a limitation of that planning process as well. It needs to be, looking at the merits of the project itself versus somebody's ability to write the narrative.
Thank you for your answer, ma'am. In the interest of time, I'd like to ask that could my office provide questions, more detailed questions to you, ma'am, that we could expect answers to, perhaps get to the bottom of this. Mr. Chairman, thank you for Thank you for the
Thank you,
time. I
gentlemen.
yield
Ms.
back.
Custer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and I just want to pick up on my colleague's suggestion. We have an opioid crisis in New Hampshire, and one of the issues is transitional housing after treatment to continue the intensive outpatient treatment, but to have a place to live. So I like your idea quite a bit. My question about these 430 buildings that we're trying to address is that a significant hurdle for disposal of vacant and underutilized buildings is finding lessees and buyers, as you talked about, because of the condition of the buildings. And my question is, have you considered whether the VA would actually spend money to bring some of the buildings up to code or make them more usable, perhaps for this type of transitional housing or other uses? And if so, or do you intend to simply demolish the buildings and use them, just sell the land? And the question relates to whether you've made any cost projections and whether you need any additional authorities or appropriations to take that approach.
At this point, we do look at all the alternatives. As I think I mentioned earlier, we're going through a due diligence process on all of these 400 and some odd buildings, and we will, there's been an initial cut that has looked at the potential for both transitional and permanent housing, and haven't found a particular need as identified at the local level, but that will be double-checked as they go through due diligence. And if there is, then we would welcome in any of these places, if there is a need, and we can put together an operator and a developer to run these and to finance these, that would be the perfect solution to us. We've encouraged it. We've done about 1,000 of these projects across the country. The more we can do, and especially since they're all third-party financed, it doesn't take away from our core mission of having those resources go directly to veterans care. So we would continue to do that. In terms of a cost estimate, we as we're doing the due diligence process, we are developing a cost estimate based upon what the chosen course of action is in each of those buildings.
So I would just sing the praises of a program in my district in Nashua, New Hampshire, Harbor Homes, that's been a game changer for our veterans. We have recently achieved a functional zero for homelessness for our veteran population, due in large part because of the transitional housing that's available. And I certainly know from the incredible stories of meeting with veterans how this has changed their life. I got to know one particular veteran. There was a sort of a camp. They were living under a bridge. He was an older gentleman, but come to find out, he was diabetic, and he had no access to medication and no access to treatment. When he got into the transitional housing, got the treatment he needed, got some counseling, some job skills training, turned his life around, and we learned that he had been middle management in a high company in our area. So he was reunited with his family. It's an incredible story. The question that I have around this that concerns me, however, is the VA's request to cut the construction budget for fiscal 18 by 4.3% or $45 million. And what will this do in terms of your capital assessment for these properties going forward? And how can we help to make sure that you have both the authorities and the resources that you need?
Sure. The FY 2018 budget for minor and major construction is what you're referring to. That would not have an impact on the disposal of these buildings.
So which budget would you be taking those funds from?
Depending upon the amount of money, would probably come out of the non-recurring maintenance budget. And in 2018, I believe it's a $600 million increase in 2018 to 1.8. I can get the exact, I think it's 1.8.
Okay.
But I do want to, because it was raised earlier, the budget, I think the major and minor construction budget figures were based upon a total discretionary dollar figure that was given to VA, and VA in these limited budget resource times had to prioritize between direct medical care, research, and other things, and it was a functioning of balancing the appropriation request to Congress to live within a total cap, and those these accounts were on the lower end of the scale, if you would.
Well, I would agree with the Secretary that every tax dollar is sacred and we need to spend it wisely, but we want to make sure that you have the resources to serve the veterans. So thank you. My time is up. I'm yielding back.
Thank you, gentlelady, for yielding. General Bergman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all of you on the panel for being here today. This is so important because all the questions you've heard, everybody's trying to make a positive difference. Mr. Sullivan, CBOCs. I see as I drive around the 1st District of Michigan, we have some nice new CBOCs that are built. Are they owned or leased?
They're all leased, I think, except for 2 or 3.
Okay. In the leasing process, could anyone tell me if they considered, regardless of where in the country, that they considered possible already existing space? Many of us have Native American tribes who have health clinics that has excess space. Were those facilities in conjunction with our tribes considered before building or leasing a CBOC?
When we go out with, I'm not the contracting expert and I can get you more details, but my understanding is that when we go out for a lease solicitation, the first option that we ask people to consider is existing building, existing space somewhere rather than having to do a build to suit a project. And some of the smaller leases, we do see that. Most of, I think, what people here were talking about earlier were all leases over $1 million, but the smaller CBOCs that are managed and contracted for at the local medical center or VISN level, they do look at existing space first.
Were the tribes given any priority?
I would have to check with
contracting.
Okay,
I'd like you to take that.
We can get that
for you
and
get back to me because, as you know, our tribal members have a high participation rate, especially in wartime. And I believe we have not only an obligation but an opportunity to partner with those already existing medical facilities that are provided for. So that's, I'd like you to look at that very closely going forward.
And there might also be the opportunity for a sharing agreement with the tribes or other entities instead of a real property instrument to be able
Absolutely.
to provide.
And thank you for using the word, because the more we get in the idea of shared services are something that are, number one, going to provide a higher quality of the care or the housing, and number two, it's going to save those valuable dollars. We know that, and thank you for going down the shared pathway. Kind of a different tack here. GAO claims, Mr. Sullivan, you're still the winner here.
Sure.
GAO claims that in 2016, VA reported 370 buildings that were either vacant or less than 50% occupied. However, last month, VA announced an initiative to begin either repurposing or disposing of 430 vacant buildings over the next 2 years. Why did so many more buildings become vacant in the last year, and how many more buildings do you expect to become vacant or largely so in the next year, and why?
I think the reason why is it can be fairly easily explained. Each year, we go out to the local users of all of our facilities, and we do an assessment and ask them to give us the status of their assets. All the leases we own, all the owned space, and all the lease space. And in that data call, we go out and ask them to say, identify facilities that are vacant. So and it closes at the end of the fiscal year, we get a report, and it takes about 2 months to process. So each December, we put out a number of what the number of vacant buildings are, and it's based upon the submissions that came in that year. Okay. So each year you'll see some are added, some are taken off, because we have been disposing of about 100 of these a year over the last 10 years. So the numbers will flex.
Is there a checklist or anything that the VA works through when you start this process that, some of us could view if we say, okay, here's what triggers it, and we ask the following questions or the criteria?
Yeah, I believe there's a validation process when they go out to validate the data in the field, and be happy to provide whatever we have to you.
Okay. Ms. Draper, was GAO able to determine costs for maintaining equipment, beds, and utility usage in unused portions of the VA medical centers?
We did not look at that for this current work.
Okay, thank you. And that's That's my last question, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, General Bergman. Mr. Creary, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first of all, I want to thank all of you, the panelists, for being here today, and to all the veterans here. Thank you for your service to our country. Wanted to follow up some of the questions of my colleagues, which are, of course, shared services, and also in my district, in my state, thinking about how many vacant buildings do we have in California, Southern California. Number two, have we reached out to local, state, county, city services, governments to address, again, the issue of homeless vets? And are we looking at operating in silos, or have we actually worked with a lot of those folks? Local municipalities, local counties, and the state, they're all raising taxes right now to address this homeless issue that continues to explode in our backyards. We're talking about 430 buildings here underutilized.
Yes, we do. One of the hallmarks, I think, of working with an enhanced use lease, especially on permanent or temporary housing, is we actually work with the local public housing authority and work with the local cities and towns, because many of the cases, some of the funding sources could come from tax credits locally or from other funding sources, as well as the operator of the facility has to be familiar with the local area and with the local providers. And in almost every case, it is a local, on-the-ground community provider who will come in and do that. I know in California, we've done that in West LA. We opened up a facility at West LA a couple of weeks ago. We have 4 more slated that are in process there, where we have developers.
That's the West LA UCLA property.
Yes, I'm working there with developers, nonprofits, to put in homeless housing for another 300 or 400 units in the next 2 years.
Any other facilities in Southern California that you're working?
I'd have to get the list.
I'd love to see that data if you have it.
Sure.
And also, in terms of the 430 facilities, we're all looking at taxpayer dollars here. We're all looking at cash flows, annual budgets, yet I can't help but think at the local level, where in Southern California, my district, school districts 30 years ago, where enrollment went down, sold a bunch of the schools. Enrollment went up. You had to go out and buy properties back at 3 or 4 times the price to make sure you had the capacity for new and merging enrollment. Just want to make sure, and I'm sure you're looking at that from a financial perspective as you move ahead. You've got to make sure you budget yourself, save those taxpayer dollars, but also looking to the future in terms of our capacity to take care of our vets.
We are.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back my time.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Let's see, Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, all members of the panel, for being here. Mr. Butler, your testimony rightly notes that many of the VA medical centers are landlocked, and which prevent them from expanding. Do you have any recommendations on how to assist those facilities to grow?
Well, I think that VA those facilities should use its existing processes in terms of SCIP and so forth to evaluate their current needs and then follow that process all the way through. The concern that we have is that process takes too long. And so VA needs to refine the process to ensure that whatever model facilities are using, that model can rapidly respond to the urgent and emergent needs available at the time.
Thank you. Mr. Rapper, in terms of your report, you make some reference to the short-term growth in demand for the VA healthcare services, followed by an eventual decline in the veteran enrollment. How will you suggest that the VA plan for that in the years ahead, and if we are aware of any other federal agency that are making plans for those kind of decline in those kind of enrollment or similar challenges?
I think it gets to a lot of the discussion earlier about ensuring that there's flexibility and what type of health services are being provided, either through bricks and mortar or through care in the community. And you know, as we reported in our report, there's some limitations with the process as it currently stands. You know, you're setting up a situation by not having an assumption in the planning process that a lot of the care is being shifted to care in the community. So
our kids that have come back to combat with wounds and so forth and so on.
We planned to have a periodic update, probably.
What's periodic?
Probably quarterly, that we're providing directly to the Secretary, and we would be happy to provide that to the committee if you desire.
I desire.
And we'll do it.
Okay, with the chairman's blessing.
I'd like
desire.
to say, you know, at Togusa, you know, an example of, you know, an enhanced use lease that we just, you know, awarded about a month ago for these housing facilities that are up there.
Great.
Is a good example of getting the community to come in and take, in that case, it wasn't unneeded buildings, it was unneeded land.
Okay.
And they're now having permanent housing at that site.
Great. And you know what happens also, if I may, is when we're disposing of these buildings that we don't need and preventing us from taking better care of our men and women in uniform, is that these assets go back on the tax rolls in the local towns and cities. They generate tax revenues if they're repurposed. That's good. We don't have a government unless we have tax revenues. Let's juice the tax revenues, right? Helps everybody. Next question. I represent one of the most rural parts of America. Tell me how you folks are retooling the VA to provide care for those in rural areas. Let's not forget rural America. About a third of our country lives in rural America, and we provide a proportionally large number of our veterans, of those that serve in the military, from rural areas because we know how to use firearms, we know how to shoot straight.
I'd ask Dr. Crump to comment on that.
I'll give you two examples of what we're doing to address.
Speak up, please. My ears are so bad.
Sorry, I'll give you two examples of what we're trying to do to address the needs of veterans in rural areas. First, we have an Office of Rural Health, and one of the things they do is focus primarily on the needs of those veterans, looking at different methodologies, sometimes innovative ways. We're putting resources out there to all of the VA medical centers, giving them the opportunity to request additional funding for things like telehealth hubs, for mental health, for primary care.
I'm almost out of time, and Mr. Rowe is very strict on time, so I'm going to get right to the chase. When it comes to these assets that are underperforming assets and costing us money, how can this issue help rural veterans?
We're conducting a plan for a methodology that would...
When's that plan going to be ready?
September, to look at a market-by-market analysis.
Okay, so that's 3 months.
Market-by-market analysis of the services and the needs of the veterans and the services available in every market, and then modernize that plan so that we can deliver that care. A combination of direct care delivery by VA, telehealth, partnerships, leases.
Thank you, sir. And early September or late September?
It will begin in September.
When's it going to be done?
Next September. That's to do 90.
Why don't you start it now and finish it this September?
We're completing the pilot and developing the methodology now. We need to socialize that with the Veterans
Good. Our
Service Organization.
staff will be in touch with you folks to make sure we can see if there's any way we can speed this up. Thank you very much, Doctor.
Thank you, Mr. Mueller. Mr. Banks, you recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. I know, Mr. Sullivan, you've already addressed questions about public-private partnerships, but I wonder if you could be more specific, get into the weeds with us a little bit as policymakers on what greater flexibility can we provide you to enhance public-private partnerships, to provide more opportunities for you to partner with the private sector on facilities across the country?
Sure, a little bit in the weeds, but we believe that there's a great market for us outleasing existing facilities and or land to a private entity and having them either upgrade them or replace them or bring in another complementary private sector entity on the same campus, which would allow them to, in essence, cross-subsidize the development costs of renovating a building or providing a new building. Right now, we do not have the authority to outlease any of our property to undertake that. And if you're looking at developing or setting up financing, there has to be an interest in the property that the private entity can take to the bank, if you will, and get financing. So having that outlease authority would allow us to do that, and we would enter into an agreement where we could occupy all of the building or a portion of the building or all of the campus or a portion of the campus in the long term. That will work where there is a market for this. It will not work at every site. So that's when I said earlier, we need a whole, if you will, suite of tools, because if there is a market in the private sector for the property and it's valuable, you can trade off that to have a public-private venture done at that site. If you have property that's in some place that has very low real estate value, very low private interest in anything going on at the site, it is going to be pretty impossible to do a public-private venture unless someone is willing to come in and donate all of the money.
How can we help you and give you that outleasing authority? Is that legislative?
Yes, it is. It would require legislation.
Okay. Are you aware of? Have there been legislative? I'm a new kid on the block on the committee. Have there been efforts to give you that authority?
We had that authority at one point. It expired. It was renewed with this committee's help to focus on housing at the time. And again, CBO is a challenge to get this legislation through, as it is with many capital-related items. So expanding the EUL authority in some form would help do that. There are various gradations of that legislation. You know, the more you give us, the higher the score may be for the legislation.
Well, I look forward to working with you on that.
Happy to work with anyone on that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. First of all, I want to thank the panel for you all being here today. It's been very, very instructive and constructive, and I think this is the beginning of a dialogue that needs to continue and will continue. Now we'll yield to Ms. Brownlee for any closing remarks.
Well, I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having the hearing, and I think it's been a productive one and the beginning of a longer conversation that we're going to have over all of this. But I do think we need to sort of expand the conversation from not just obsolete facilities, but, you know, what are the opportunities around public-private partnerships, the leasing issues. All of this, I think, is, you know, under the same umbrella of, you know, how we move forward and be in a mode of continuous improvement as it relates to our facilities, where we, you know, as time goes on, how are we going to remove facilities and enhance facilities where they are needed in a more timely way. So with that, I would yield back and thank you again for the hearing.
Thank you all. And again, I appreciate the panel being here. You all have been very helpful. And this is a very complex, emotional issue. And it's going to have to be done, as Secretary Principi said, in a very thoughtful way, an open, transparent way, where everyone who's involved has input. And I can just tell you that when you live in rural America, and Mr. Pollockman mentioned this, you know, we're in rural America where I live, we're seeing businesses shuttered. We don't see the growth that you see in other areas. And when you see a public facility, whether it's a post office or whether it's a school, an indication that your community is dying and not growing, and you see a VA close or taking buildings down, it affects the whole community. I totally understand that. And we have to be sensitive to that. But we also have to be sensitive to the fact that the mission of the VA is to provide health care, the very top quality health care we can to our veterans, our servicemen and women who've served this great country. And I think Ms. Brownlee brought up a great point, several great points about using leasing, where you can be more nimble and put the CBOCs in outpatient clinics where much care is given, where the veterans actually are. And the demographics, as I think was pointed out, Mr. Draper pointed out, are changing, not just for veterans, but for the American population. I mean, Texas in 2010 picked up 4 congressional seats. That's 3 million people that moved into Texas. That more demand, probably many of them are veterans. You know, I think the capital needs, and we're looking at a $4 billion a year, $50 billion deficit it looks like, and we're spending around $2 billion a year. I think we need the information of where do we need those capital assets before we go out and just build a bunch of stuff and then realize, whoops, we put this in the wrong place. So I think that needs to be done. And the VA's track record on capital has been spotty when you look at Denver and New Orleans and Orlando and so forth, and we know we can do better. Just the leasing of a major lease, I read in the documents that I was given that it takes 9 years from the time the VA plans it to the actual activation of the lease, whereas the private sector is 3 years. We have to get better at that, and we will. I think we certainly will with the leadership that we have. And I think one of the things you have to do is involve the veteran community when we're making these decisions. What do the veterans want the VA to look like, and what services do they want? And I think they're actually telling us by where they're going to get their care. So I can't thank you enough. This is not something that's going to get a lot of publicity, and nobody's going to go home to the Kiwanis Club and say, I'm talking about VA assets. I mean, that's like talking about the fiduciary rule that I got to talk about on the other committee I'm on. But it is incredibly important for the future of the VA and how we care for our veterans. And with that, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to advise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material. And without objection, so ordered. Hearing is adjourned.